So you talk about how he drifted rightward in the Reagan era, and he voted for first for Reagan's budget, and then his tax cuts. He was a deficit hawk, and yet his donors were both unions and corporations. You contrast that with how Bernie dealt with Reaganism as a mayor of Burlington. I thought that was really interesting. And how he attacked special interest, whereas in the quote before, he was defending special interest. And then you talk about how he was part of the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Committee, and which Clinton was involved, Bill Clinton was involved with, and how he supported the Anything But Jesse movement in 1988. And of course, Bernie Sanders was very much part of that effort. Is there anything else you want to say about the 80s before we get to the crime bill?
That was also the decade that Biden shifted on foreign policy. Again, looking at what happened with Reagan and deciding, the answers we have to become more willing to use force. So I think that's another key kind of turning point to note in that decade for Biden.
He ran for president in 1988, but he had to drop out. He got like 0.9% of the vote or something in Iowa. He was killed because of his plagiarism. All that came out, a couple of instances of plagiarism. His exaggerating about his civil rights activism and his opposition to the war. I love this part because you know how he's going around insulting voters and telling them they should vote for somebody else or calling them fat or whatever he's doing? He has a tendency to do that. We can't just attribute that to his senility because he had an April 7th event in New Hampshire. This is his 88 presidential run. And somebody asked him which law school he attended and where he placed. And perceiving it as a slight, you write, Biden had reacted badly. He'd shot back that he had, quote, ended up in the top half of his class, graduated with 3 degrees, was, quote, the outstanding student in the political science department, and had gone to law school on a full academic scholarship. He then told the question, he would be delighted to sit back and compare my IQ to yours if you'd like, unquote. All of this was proven to be untrue. So that was an instance that just kind of reminded me of, it's more than just a gaffe. I mean, do you find that even these insults to voters, is it like Teflon? Do they not care about that either?
I mean, I wouldn't say so. There was that immigration activist, for example, who Biden, when he was challenged, we challenged Biden on immigration. Biden said, "Well, why don't you go for vote for Trump?" And then that activist ended up joining the Bernie Sanders campaign. And I think, the idea that you can insult voters and still think that you can cruise to victory is pretty mistaken, I think. I mean, think back to how Hillary Clinton, how the deplorables comment came to haunt her, I mean, one thing I want to say about that is the 87 campaign, and what's astounding to me is watching him have the exact same behavior, not just the aggressiveness towards anyone who challenges him or anytime he feels slighted, but also the relentless lying that got him to leave the race in 87. Actually, before he never even made it to Iowa that year because of the scandal. I mean, now he's running a campaign that is just as dishonest. He's repeating again that he was a civil rights worker. He's lying about his vote in the Iraq War. He's lying about positions he took, positions he's already taken, bills that he authored, all this stuff. And what's amazing to me, and this really shows you the contrast between what's happening now with the media and what's happening in 87. He's not being called out on it. If you look at maybe left-wing and right-wing media, they note these things. They note his mendacity. But Biden, I think of the debate with Sanders, the only one-on-one debate they had, and Biden just lied his way through the entire debate. Said absurd things like, "I never even wrote the bankruptcy bill. That's not my bill."
Well, I have to fault Bernie for that because, to be honest with you, Bernie should have come with a piece of paper, the transcript. I mean, every lawyer knows you don't ask the question so that he could lie and say no. What you do is you say, why did you say in 1992 in the floor of the Senate, and I quote, I voted to increase Social Security once, I voted to increase it twice, and I voted to increase it a third time. That's how you ask that question. You don't ask him if he said it, especially when he's a known liar, and then tell the viewers that they should go to the YouTube to find it out for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, The thing is, though, think back to 2012, right? Obama and Romney were having a debate, and Romney claimed that this is a completely meaningless issue, but it became this big flashpoint in the debate where Romney said Obama never called the attack in Benghazi a terrorist attack. And Obama went to Kenny Crowley, who was the moderator, and he said, Kenny, can you tell us what the facts were? And she said, no, that's not true, Governor Romney. He did say it. It became this big thing because it made Romney look like a fool and a liar, which he was. And what happened during that debate, I mean, not only did the moderators not correct the record, which is why I even have moderators if you're not going to bother calling out obvious lies, but they actually had a question prepped for that very issue towards Sanders, a very misleading question that suggested that he had actually called for cuts to Social Security. And then the post-game analysis, they then proceed to talk about how presidential Biden looked on stage. Whereas, for me, someone who's stayed his career and someone who's just paid a modicum amount of attention to the campaign over the course of 2019 and 2020, I just watching it spotted about 5 or 6 lies that you would think journalists, people who go on TV to talk about the news would be able to talk about. So I think Sanders could have made a more forceful case, but I mean, at the end of the day, this is the media's job.
The media, okay, look, the media, they're corporate stenographer. They're stenographers for the corporate state. That's what they do. I mean, when you look at these media outlets, they're owned by companies that Bernie Sanders poses an existential threat to. He single-handedly, as a senator, opposed the ATT Time Warner merger. He supported the CNN workers who won the largest National Labor Relations Board award of $76 million. He publicly supported them. He goes against Comcast, all the time, which owns MSNBC. So it's not surprising to me that Bernie is going to get a bad shake by the mainstream media. This is why I thought he should have run as an independent the second time after he knew what kind of shake he was going to get by them, and why he should have spent more on his ground game. I'm going to be writing a big article of my own about the faults of the Sanders campaign. And one of them was he didn't have any ground game after the state of California. He didn't even have a very good one in South Carolina, from what I'm finding out right now. And the only way to counteract the negative framing of the mainstream media is to have those one-on-one conversations at the doors. Yes, I agree with you. The number one factor leading Bernie Sanders' defeat is the corporate mainstream media, because if they had anointed him and praised him and shown his town halls and done all that stuff that they did for these other centrists, somebody said, well, look, they criticized Trump all the time in 2016. Yes, well, they may have criticized him, but they gave him $5 billion worth of free advertising. The famous example is when Bernie won this upset in Michigan, and instead of covering his acceptance victory rally, had an empty podium and the graphic said waiting for Trump. So I feel like, Bernie should have known about that and adjusted his campaign accordingly.
Yeah, that's Sanders made some mistakes, but this is bigger than Sanders. I mean, we should demand more of the press. I think the press is a really important institution for maintaining a healthy democracy anywhere. And it's not just that the press was it's controlled by these corporations, and so that's it. I mean, the press was a corporate press back in the 80s, but there's a tangible difference in how they, Biden had to leave the campaign because of his lies in the 80s. In just the early months of 2020, I mean, think about the Nelson Mandela story they made up, which once upon a time may well have signaled the end of his campaign, but it wasn't really, the New York Times reported on it to their credit, but it wasn't really brought up as an issue ever. And I think we need to demand more, whether it's corporate press or not, we still need to demand more from journalists. Otherwise, what is the point? If it's just Democrat-aligned media, not reporting on Democrats, then that's not good.
Well, you probably have read Chris Hedges' Death of the Liberal Classes. He talks about how all these institutions that are supposed to help working people have been co-opted or corrupted. And he includes the press, he includes the Democratic Party, he includes unions, he includes the clergy, he includes universities. It's really so eye-opening to read that book. But getting back to Biden, so in the 80s, let's talk about his crime bill, the crime bill of 84, and also the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. Can you talk about some of the highlights of those bills and how detrimental they were?
Yeah, so the 1984 bill was basically a rewriting of the criminal code that he worked on with Strom Thurmond, who people might know as the racist rapist, who was one of the most ardent segregationists in the Senate. And they worked together to basically, Strom Thurmond's focus became around crime. After, with the kind of like outright civil rights battles and the outright racism of the past kind of now not able to be expressed in polite society, that was the turn where it was focusing on crime, which also did much to undo progress made in civil rights through the 60s. And that bill, that first bill in 1984, it, for example, abolished parole. It expanded civil forfeiture. So among other things, it actually made it easier for states to profit off civil forfeiture. And for people who don't know, civil forfeiture is basically when law enforcement says, well, we suspect you're doing something illegal and we're going to, take this envelope of cash or what have you that we found in your car and seize it because we think it may have been the proceeds of something illegal. And they don't have to necessarily prove it. And that's been used for decades now as a way for police organizations to for example, fill up gaps in their budgets or, just use it to kind of have some fun with. Really devastating for a lot of working class people, particularly black and brown. And actually made it easier, even if state laws barred the use of civil forfeiture and getting sort of monetary value out of it. That law made it so that local police and law enforcement would send whatever they seized to the federal government, and the federal government would return it to the states, bypassing those laws. And probably the most important thing that bill did was set mandatory minimum sentencing, which meant basically it took away the discretion of judges to, vary sentences depending on person, depending on the exact nature of the offense and that kind of thing. And so basically, if you commit a law, this is how long you have to go to jail for, no matter what. Which led to the explosion of prisons. In '86, the '86 law, that was the one that infamously established the crack and powder cocaine sentencing disparity. 100 to 1 sentencing disparity if you are dealing or have possession of crack, dealt with much more harshly than if you possess or are dealing powder cocaine. And it put a whole bunch of other very strict punishments on there. For example, if you killed someone while dealing drugs, you would get the death penalty and that kind of thing, and a lot more, thousands of dollars worth of fines and very harsh jail terms if you even possess the drugs, not even if you're dealing it or doing anything else criminal, but just possessing the drug. All of that would lead to much more than 1994 crime bill, lead to the escalation of mass incarceration in the United States.
Okay, now then Biden became the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and he presided over the infamous hearings on Clarence Thomas. You have an excellent section in your book which gets into much more. You talk about how the Supreme Court swung right under Biden. He called Scalia a conservative, but not an extremist. He was good defeating Robert Bork, but he gave softballs to Anthony Kennedy. And you talk about he had bad questioning of Clarence Thomas. Talk about how he screwed Anita Hill in that. Now, I was aware that he did not call corroborating witnesses that could have corroborated her story about Clarence Thomas. But I didn't realize some of the other things. Can you talk about, because this is the type of thing that those women who were so concerned about Kavanaugh ought to be a little bit more concerned about, except they are the pink pussy hat, fake resistance, as I call them. They only liked Bill Clinton. They threw Monica Lewinsky under the bus because Bill Clinton was good on abortion rights. But Biden has not had a great record on that. But before we get into that, talk about what he did to Anita Hill and how he, besides not calling those corroborating witnesses, how he harmed her.
Yeah, and I'll just add actually as well, he had actually suggested Anthony Kennedy to Reagan in the first place. So that's the other thing to note there. But with Thomas, Biden, first of all, when he got wind of the allegation, he uh, said that, well, it wouldn't be fair to present this anonymously without the person actually making the accusation there, because it's not fair for Thomas to be accused and not to face an accuser, which is a made-up rule. This was not anything that had followed in previous hearings or anything. It was a rule that Biden himself just completely made up. The fact that there was these sexual harassment allegations against Thomas probably wouldn't have even been an issue if not for eventually there was a leak. And that's really what forced the issue. Biden, basically worked to keep it quiet. Once the hearings got going, Biden, and people at the time said this, people who worked for other senators, they said that Biden essentially just bent over backwards to give the Republicans everything that they wanted. Among those things, obviously, he kept those witnesses from coming forward, but also on the final day of the hearings, he, for example, just gave unlimited time to character witnesses for Thomas, so just person after person after person testifying about what a decent, great person he was, and so on, which squeezed out anyone else who may have been testifying, and basically just it made him seem a lot better. He allowed, as per the Republican request, he allowed Thomas to testify twice, so he would get the first word and the last word, and Anita Hill would be kind of sandwiched in between. And then in the second one, Thomas was actually testifying. He was doing this rebuttal testimony on prime time. So basically, when people got back from work, they tuned into the TV. What they were going to see was Clarence Thomas making his kind of point-by-point rebuttal of Anita Hill and kind of calling it a high-tech lynching and all that stuff, without seeing Anita Hill's testimony. And Biden actually afterwards, when it was all said and done, he actually ran out to witnesses who had testified for Thomas, and he shook their hands reportedly, and he said, good work out there. I totally believe you. All this kind of thing. So there's more to it. It's a very long story. There's actually Jane Meyer and Jill Abramson. That account was very heavily based on their book. It's worth reading.
Yeah.
I think another thing to point out, an important thing to point to in that case is the fact that Ted Kennedy, for example, he didn't really say anything, even though he had previously gone up against Bork and helped to torpedo him, and partly that was because of his own personal foibles with treatment of women, and the Republicans actually run ads before the hearing saying, "Well, can Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden do they have the kind of spotless moral record that they can't be accused of something?" For example, so Ted Kennedy kept silent. And then, at the time, Howard Mitzenbaum, who was a senator from Ohio, a Democrat, when he heard about these charges, Hill's charges, he said, "Well, if that's sexual harassment, half the Senate could be accused." And then you think about some of the stuff we've heard about Biden's treatment of women, the kind of harassment at the very least, that how he treats women and female employees and that kind of thing. You have to wonder whether that played any role in how he adjudicated that hearing.
Well, you say in your book that he told people at the time that he didn't believe her. And we know that he hasn't properly apologized to her, and she's still bitter about it. But the question remains, like you said, we've seen his behavior, and he was known as Creepy Joe. And at first it was just a matter of, sniffing people's hairs and touching them, hugging them, whatever, just kind of creepiness. But now he has a credible sexual assault accusation against him. And I know there's holes in this story, and I don't want you to get into like whether you believe it or not, but it's just interesting to me that, the quote unquote Me Too movement, like Alyssa Milano, who was out there protesting Brett Kavanaugh, apparently she deleted Me Too from her Twitter profile and, basically made a weak case against why Tara Reade's charges shouldn't be believed. And similarly, the women's publication Jezebel made a similar case. And this just reminds me, I'm getting triggered of the way that they treated Monica Lewinsky, throwing her under the bus again because Bill was good on abortion. But Joe has had a very mixed record on abortion. Everybody knows that he only recently came around to say that his support of the Hyde Amendment was wrong. But you talk about other things that he's done. How do you think, you don't have to list them all, but just how do you think the women's groups are dealing with this? I mean, surely they would have wanted anybody but him. But now that they've got him, do you think they're just going to eat it?
Yeah, I mean, the Tara Reade allegation is kind of a microcosm of this. I mean, for the past 3-4 years, we've heard Democrats and kind of the liberal press, the feminist press particularly, talking about the importance of believing women and Me Too and all this kind of stuff, which I completely agree with. And they've completely gone back on all of that now that Biden's been accused. So, I mean, if they're willing to give him a pass on that and sort of cover for him, I'm not surprised that they're going to go full on behind Biden. And I mean, there's a practical element to that, which I understand, because at the end of the day, even despite Biden's terrible votes in the past and positions and all this kind of stuff, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that the person who's going to be president is at least more sympathetic. If that's the only choice you have between someone who's outright hostile and someone who's a terrible record, but it could be pushed. I can understand why they're going to back him. But yeah, I mean, he's through his career, he hasn't really been. He's actually been very opposed to abortion rights, and actually in stark contrast to how he responded to anti-busing activists in Delaware. Around the same time, abortion rights activists were pressuring him and going to his office and everything because he was supporting the Hatch Amendment, which was even more strict and would have. Or could have potentially led to the outlawing of abortion all over the country, and he resisted their pressure tactics. So that shows you there's a lot of people talking about, well, Biden can be pushed to be more progressive, and of course, given the situation that we're in, that's the best case scenario. That's the only outcome that one can really hope for. But I mean, I think that really shows that through his entire career, Biden's always been more receptive to being pushed by the right than he has to actually being pushed by liberals or kind of left-wing groups.
Yes. Now, before we get off of the 80s and we get into the Clinton years, you have a very important chapter, a very important paragraph here that you end chapter 3 with, and I will read it. Politics, and more specifically, the Republican Party, were rapidly changing. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating in the 1990s, the GOP began its transformation into what political scientists Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein in 2012 called an insurgent outlier, one that was, quote, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited social and economic policy regime, scornful of compromise, and unpersuaded by conventional understanding of facts, evidence, and science, unquote. But Biden and many other Democrats wouldn't notice this transformation until too late. Their view of the U.S. political system would remain frozen in time, rooted in the clubby, honor-bound, and compromised focus Senate culture of Biden's early years. It would make them useful patsies for an ever more ruthless and right-wing team of Republicans. So I think that is really accurate. And I would also say that it applies to centrist Democrats, which is why I fault Bernie for wanting to stay in the Senate. He has been in that institution, also Congress, for 30 years. And he has that desire to be liked by his colleagues. And he talks about my friend Joe Biden and my friend Harry Reid. And I feel like he should have, and I've said this before on my show, he should have voted no on that bill, quit the Senate, and led his movement for rent strikes and general strike, because that is what we need now in this time, and not trying to get incremental reforms in these bailout bills that have already been shown to be so horrific. And he voted for this thing. I mean, every day something worse is coming out about this. So, I mean, do you think that this institutional clubbiness that you're talking about is just so nefarious that it even, sucked in someone like Bernie Sanders?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it really sucked him. I mean, some of the stuff, my friend Joe Biden, I know there's reports that, he generally likes Biden and all this stuff. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, Sanders is a politician, and he says stuff like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that he actually means it. I don't, I suspect a lot of that behavior had more to do with fear of kind of like being immediate pressure of criticizing another candidate too much. But I mean, yeah, I mean this is the issue, and it's a structural issue with the U.S. Senate and with the entire political system of the United States, where that system was designed with the idea that there weren't going to be political parties, right? Well, at the very least, if there were political parties, there were going to be weak parties where every individual senator could be kind of a very unique, chaotic kind of figure who would blaze their own trail. And that's kind of how it worked for a while. Even, in the 70s and everything before then, during the 1930s and the Roosevelt, you did have diversity within each party. So there were conservative Democrats, there were liberal Republicans. I mean, Boggs, the guy who Biden beat in 1972, he himself was a liberal Republican. He had a very good civil rights record. Actually, he was supported by civil rights people more than Biden was when he ran against them. But that changed, especially with the 90s. And what happened was from there on, the GOP, very smartly, the GOP has very well-disciplined, rigid kind of uniformity, ideological uniformity. Not completely, but if you look at votes, it's often, on really big things, it often ends up being Republicans voting lockstep for something, and then Democrats, half of them saying no, but then a key number, half or smaller, crossing over and voting with them. And the problem now is that you have the system where that wasn't designed for a parliamentary style. But the Republican Party has become a parliamentary party where they almost, not almost every time, but in key votes, they again and again and again vote in lockstep as a bloc. And the Democrats don't. The Democrats have no real discipline or ideological uniformity beyond sort of this, the belief in kind of centrism and that kind of thing. And so, I mean, I don't know if that's going to change. What you really need is somebody like Gingrich and that whole class of Republicans, but from the left, people who are willing to, and have the numbers, more importantly. I mean, you can't just have a few people in the Senate and House. You need to have a larger number of people coming in and saying, hey, we are going to act as a bloc on certain things unless we get our way. I think it's worth looking back at those Republicans in the 90s and since and seeing how they did this, how they did things, because that is, beyond some of the more horrible things they did, like creating shutdowns and all kinds of things like that, they have been very good at extracting concessions, even from Democratic administrations.
Yeah, but what happened during the Clinton years is that he gave them every policy that they wanted. And it was been said, because Obama did things similarly, that things that Republicans couldn't do overtly, they were able to do with these Democratic presidents, these centrists. And then you had people like Biden supporting him. And he made this quote about liberals that just reminded me of Obama's, when the only time he got mad was to criticize what he called the professional left. Here you have a quote here when you were talking about Lani Guinier and how people jettisoned her to lead the Civil Rights Division, and he didn't support her. He actually lashed out at the, quote, idiotic groups out there, unquote, like the, quote, XYZ Group for American Values or the QSY Group to Save All the Women of the World. I mean, can you imagine? That's just so atrocious to me. Now, we can't go over all this. I'm just going to mention, you talk about Centrust, this company in California that he did favors for. You talk about how he took $150,000 over this decade from health insurers, and he didn't support single payer. He cut federal spending. He supported cutting federal spending, spoke out against, and yet he spoke out against protecting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. He won in 96, his reelection, but then he supported balanced budgets and really pushed for them. He gave Bush a fast track for NAFTA. This is before even Clinton proposed it. And he was speaking out of both sides of his mouth. I have a quote here from your book. In 2013, on a floor speech, he launched into a spirited attack on critics of unions. How dare we tell these people not to worry, he shouted. If you saw your future decimated, you would have every reason to be frightened. This is not a false fear, unquote. He then dismissed the arguments on both sides of the issue as, quote, vastly overblown, unquote, claiming labor only opposed NAFTA, quote, because they have nothing else to criticize, unquote. After only briefly explaining his report, he declared it, quote, the best deal we are going to get now, end quote. With his vote and that of 26 other Democrats, NAFTA passed the Senate. So what I want to know is, this is such flim-flam. I mean, it's not dissimilar to Hillary's public positions and her private positions, because this is a public position. Even within the same speech, he's speaking to both audiences. And this is an art. I mean, you've got to admire his ability to be able to do this and get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, politics is a field that you can go far in if you don't really have any principles and just want to, you know, go ahead and if you don't mind lying or saying anything to people to get ahead. And I think that's Biden's career. I mean, if you look at the scope of his time in the Senate and beyond, this kind of stuff is very common. It's telling, you know, conservative audiences one thing, telling liberal audiences a completely different thing. He did it even in '78. He got a endorsement from Howard Jarvis, who maybe some of your listeners are familiar. He was kind of the father of Proposition 13, and he had given Biden his endorsement, and along with a few hundred other people. And Biden, his office sent back a statement saying, well, you know, we appreciate that Senator Biden has been recognized as a leader in kind of keeping government limited and keeping taxes down and all this kind of stuff. And then later he brought it up to a mostly black audience, and somebody said, well, hey, he said Proposition 13 is a terrible idea. Someone said, wait a minute, but didn't you get an endorsement from Howard Jarvis? And he said, well, you know, I can't help who endorses me. I have no feeling about it whatsoever. And this happens throughout his career, despite running initially on being honest and trustworthy and having integrity and willing to say things to people that they wouldn't want to hear. The pattern in his career, what that really amounts to is that he tells liberal audiences what they don't want to hear. So he's often bashing liberal ideas, but conservatives, he tells them, you know, he just sides with them. And often, yeah, he changes his stance on things. We're seeing that now.
Yeah. Now, the NAFTA thing, he just voted for it. He wasn't so much of an architect of it, but he really actively worked with Gingrich on welfare reform. I want you to talk about how he did that. But first, I want to read another one of your quotes, because I think these are seminal. The push for welfare reform, and you have welfare reform in quotes, as we all do when we talk about it, had revealed a fundamental truth of U.S. politics. Even as partisan gridlock and dysfunction began to take hold of the U.S. political system during the 1990s, the American ruling class was more than capable of coming together to get things done, as long as it flattered the interests of the country's most powerful, and its victims were the working class. Just as with NAFTA, Biden and the Democrats' support for all this would, in the long run, further sever their links to the party's working class base and swell the ranks of the disenchanted and politically engaged. And why this quote particularly appeals to me at this time is we have seen this happen just in the past month with the corporate bailout. You know, they said, how can you pay for it? That's what the entire campaign, asking Bernie Sanders, how are you going to pay for it? But they were able to find the money, you know, and come together when it came to bailing out these corporations and the banks. And that's why the stock market has regained, you know, 30% of its loss, because they are having absolutely no trouble getting access to money. Whereas, workers and homeowners and small businesses are. So talk about what he did with the crime bill, with welfare reform, and then we're going to go on to the bankruptcy bill.